So first of all, I want to thank you all for coming. It's less cold than it was last night, so it's easier. I want to thank the University Catholic Center for co-sponsoring this talk with us. By us, I mean the Austin Institute for the Study of Family and Culture, that I have the pleasure to, well, first I worked for it, now I run it. My name is Mariana Orlandi, say Dr. Orlandi, but my name is still Mariana, regardless. The Austin Institute for the Study of Feminine Culture, for those of you who don't know it, is a place where people can come to look for some truth, but objective truth. Now, it happens that a lot of time, these people are already Christian or Catholic. It's not a requirement, though. So if you like tonight's talk, and if you have friends who might be looking for truth and might need a place where they hear something that is true and that opens up dialogue, I think you should send them to the Austin Institute. Also, you should, if you're gonna like tonight's talk, because I think you will love it, and I'll say more about that, just know that Dr. Snell is gonna give another talk for us tomorrow afternoon, so you get the second chance. And is also giving a less public book talk on Saturday mornings. You might have 3 chances to hear and speak. Just go on our website, www.austidenchinstitute.org, and you will find everything, and you just need to register. Now, that said, you're about to listen to an amazing talk, and I know what I'm talking about because I read his book, and I also gifted it to someone here, and there's nothing else I'm talking about now. Like, it's become my thing. Talk about sloth. When I was your age, and I'm doing an average, I know that there's very few people that maybe are my age or above, but like, if I do an average, when I was your age, so much younger, I thought that acedia, or sloth, was laziness. I didn't realize that the reason I forgot to bring Dr. Snell bio is because I am a victim of what sloth actually can be. Maybe I'm not a victim, I don't know. But like this idea that modernity has this problem of like us being constantly busy, but very often missing the point, right? It's like, why am I doing all these things? So I'm guessing that this is what we're gonna hear about today in today's talk. What I can say about Dr. Snell is that he's the executive director, the director of academic programs of the Witherspoon Institute at Princeton. He is the author of a book on acedia, a book, the most recent is on hope, and it was before hope was declared the theme of the year, so you got there first. Right. Professor of philosophy before getting to the Witherspoon Institute. But what I could say about Dr. Snell is that he has been an insanely valuable mentor to some of the greatest minds that have gone through Princeton, forming them as young men, fully flourishing young men. I've had the pleasure to meet some of them. Women too, but someone else has done this job, I think, maybe. I don't know. All right, so that said, what else can I say about Snell? Probably nothing. You should just shut up. If you want to know more about us and the Austin Institute, there are, I think, 4 of our interns are all around. So if you just, ask for who are, would you raise your hands? Okay, so if you want to know more after the talk, just talk to them. RJ, please.
Thank you. Mariana. Am I talking into the mic, or am I talking into this?
The big one.
The big one. Okay, good. Hi, everybody. Good to have you here. Thanks for finding some time this evening. I hope that you don't evaluate whether you should go to the Austin Institute by whether or not you like this talk. I'm sure they do far better things at the Austin Institute than I'm going to do tonight. So don't judge it by this. I have to admit that I'm a nice Canadian boy, and I got totally out-negotiated by the Italian Mariana Orlandi here. She said, would you come to Austin and give a talk? And I said, yeah, I'll come to Austin and give a talk. And pretty soon I was giving 3 different talks on 3 different days. So, us nice Canadians. Speaking of nice Canadians, I actually considered feigning illness tonight, because you may know that tonight is the championship of 4 nations in Team Canada and Team USA, and there's a lot on the line given the fights that occurred in the last one. But I am recently become a dual citizen. I finally become an American citizen after living here since 1993. I told my wife I wouldn't become a citizen until Queen Elizabeth died, and then she just lived forever. So I'm having enormous conflicts of allegiances tonight where I feel like I'm going to be cheering for everyone fighting on both sides. Perhaps you're familiar with the fiction of Cormac McCarthy, best known for No Country for Old Men and The Road. But of all McCarthy's fiction, and especially the horrors of it, I think that none of it is more horrible and more terrifying than the character of Judge Halden in the novel Blood Meridian. Blood Meridian recounts John Joel Glanton's gang of bounty hunters who slaughter and scalp and desecrate their way across the Southwest. Brutality is pervasive throughout the book. In fact, in the words of the book, war endures and it grinds everything into oblivion because it is the ultimate trait of human life. Now, early in the novel, the protagonist, who's nameless, identified only as the kid throughout the novel, runs away from his drunken father. You want me nearer?
I'm just going to pick this up for you.
You want me shorter? Thank you. He runs away from his drunken father to join the gang to hunt Apaches. They're hunting Apaches because they get a scalp bounty. And they do so mercilessly. In fact, they'll kill anyone and then claim that they're Apaches. And they meet this character, Judge Halden, who leads them like some sort of perverse Moses through the American deserts. And this character, the judge, is absolutely horrific. One gang member describes his first encounter with the judge as follows. They have spent all their gunpowder and they are in flight. They're running away from the Apaches who are in pursuit. And they're realizing that they have no place to run and no hope. But as they flee, they come across the judge, who they never met before, sitting on a rock alone in the desert, as if he'd always been there. In fact, it's the only rock that is in that section of the desert. And so it's very strange. It's as if he appeared without any cause at all. In the words of the kid, you couldn't tell where he'd come from. And he doesn't have a horse, he doesn't have a canteen, he's just sitting on this rock as if he'd been expecting us. When Glanton informs the judge of the situation, Judge Halden takes charge and he calmly helps them make gunpowder out of the resources of the desert. And when the Apaches come, their gunpowder is described as having some magical powers. Not a shot misses. Every shot they take, they're getting a victim. In fact, at that point, Judge Halden takes over the gang. He kind of removes Glanton from authority, and the rest of the gang is described as having some terrible covenant with the judge. This phrase comes up several times, a terrible covenant. Now, just as odd as his appearance in the desert, the entire history of the judge appears to be without cause. At one scene, they go to the town and they go into the public baths. And every one of the characters, as they enter to wash the filth and gore from their body, is described as having missing fingers or a maimed ear or a suture or a tattoo. And the judge is described as being entirely hairless and having no body marks of any sort whatsoever, as if he's strangely childlike and has no history to his life at all. Now, here's what's interesting about that. Despite being described as having no history, he's the most educated and learned man in the Southwest. He knows geology, geography, natural history, myth, literature, and multiple languages. He discourses eloquently on a variety of subjects. And he appears to have authority over all of his interlocutors. He wins all of the arguments. He's particularly interested with artifacts from earlier moments of history, but he almost always destroys what he finds. At one point, he sketches some cave drawings in his book and then scratches the drawings off the wall. At another point, he finds a piece of armor from the earlier Spanish, sketches it, and then destroys it. Here's the quote. He took up the little footguard, the little piece of armor. He turned it in his hand. He studied it again and again before he crushed it into a ball of foil and pitched it into the fire. He gathered up all the other artifacts and cast them all into the fire as well, and he seemed much satisfied. Now note, for the judge, knowledge is a kind of hunt. He captures reality, owns reality, and in so doing, snuffs out independence of being. All things for the judge, personal and impersonal, are treated this way, as something to possess and destroy. He's a pedophile and he collects children along the way. He abuses them and leaves them to rot and die in the desert. He makes a pet out of a mentally incapacitated man, leading him on a leash throughout the desert before killing and abandoning him. At one point, the judge finally explains himself. He articulates his reason for capturing and destroying. Here's what he says. Whatever exists, whatever in creation exists without my knowledge exists without my consent. These anonymous creatures, he's talking about birds here, these anonymous creatures may seem little or nothing in the world, yet the smallest crumb can devour us. Any smallest thing beneath yon rock out of man's knowing. Only nature can enslave man, and only when the existence of each last entity is routed out and made to stand naked before man will he be properly suzerain of the earth. No one knows what the suzerain is in the text, so they ask him, and he defines it as following. He says, a suzerain is a special kind of ruler, ruling even where there are other rulers, one whose authority countermands other judgments. The judge's authority is such as to be utterly autonomous, but if his authority is autonomous, no other autonomous life can be permitted. Nothing, he says, can be permitted to occur save by my dispensation, even if that means molesting and killing everything under his rule. Well, that's an interesting description. I want to suggest in our reflections tonight that the judge is an image of the ancient vice of sloth. We can all fight about how to say this, either acedia or acedia or acedia. You can pick your poison on how you want to say the Latin. I'm happy with either. I'll probably go with acedia. Here's what I want to suggest. We tend to think that sloth is a kind of laziness. Like if I say I'm slothful, it must mean I'm lazy. That is not what the patristics and the medievals understood sloth to be. And I want to suggest that the character of the judge, with this fervent desire for autonomy rather than responsibility, is what sloth is. And I want to explore it in two different forms of sloth. Here's the first. It's a hatred of responsibility and a hatred of place. Acedia, if you've read anything about this, was called by the ancients the noonday demon. So called because it tends to strike in the middle of the afternoon. I'm sure you've had this experience. You're in the laboratory, you're in the library, it's 3 o'clock, you're supposed to be doing a problem set, you're supposed to be doing a literature review. And it has become entirely tedious to you. You've had this experience? Now, because you live in 2025, the way you deal with this is it's 3:05. You check your Instagram account. You check X. I don't know, whatever you're on. You're so bored, you check LinkedIn. In fact, you're more bored than that. You see what grandma's political views are on Facebook. Okay? You put your phone away, not satisfied. You look at your problem set. You're still bored because the time is moving very slowly, yes? You pick out your phone. It's now 3:03. Who's done this? That's sloth. But why? Here's what Evagrius of Ponticus, a 4th century Egyptian desert father, says. It's the noonday demon, which causes the monk continuously to look at the windows and forces him to step out of his cell. Remember, he's supposed to be in his cell at prayer, and gaze at the sun to see how far it is still from the 9th hour. Yes, you've had this experience? Time's just not moving. And to look around here and there, whether any of his brethren are near. The point of this for Evagrius is the monk is supposed to be at his prayers. He's not supposed to be at chatting. He's not supposed to be in conversation. Moreover, here's the interesting line, the demon sends him hatred against the place, against life itself, and against the work of his hands. This is the first version of sloth. Hatred of this place, hatred against life itself, and hatred of the work of his hands. How many of you at some point in the last semester have considered transferring out of the University of Texas at Austin at about 3:15 on a Wednesday? How many of you at some point, 3:17 on a Wednesday, have felt enormous hatred against the place and against the work that you have to do just now? More hands go up. That's sloth. Here's what Evagrius says, or here's my sense of it.
Does this count for classes that are not part of our major?
It even is for the required freshman classes. So it turns out, here's the argument I'm going to make. Because providence is what it is, the main way that you have to encounter God and the meaning of life is the work that you have at this very moment immediately in front of you. I was telling someone today, I was telling Kenny today, when I was a grad student, I taught an 8 a.m. logic class, required for all students. So you can imagine how excited they were to be at my class at 8 a.m. in a required class. That at 8:01, studying a barber syllogism is the main avenue you have to meet God at that moment. Going off text here, you know the story, the parable of the sower of the seed? I grew up in a farm, 10,000 acre farm and ranch, and the story of the parable of the seed used to outrage me. Because if you're a good farmer, you don't waste good seed on rocky soil. If you're a good farmer, you don't plant wheat or corn in alkaline soil. So I was annoyed by the story. But then, of course, I remembered at one point that the sower here is God. The sower here is Jesus Christ. And his seed bag, which is grace, is inexhaustible. And he's going to throw it on stones and alkaline and thorns and bushes and good soil because he loses nothing by giving grace away. So at 8:02 in your required class, that is where God is attempting to meet you just now. And if you're bored with it, you're slothful. Because you hate this place that God is trying to meet you. This work where God is trying to meet you. This life where God is trying to meet you. That's Evagrius' point. So sloth isn't laziness, although the term in time comes to mean that. It doesn't mean inactivity. Rather, it means frustration, a disgust at the life that God has given us and the work that God has given us to do. Whatever the particularity of the life and the good and the work that God has offered to us just now. In acedia, the monk longs for a better place because he abhors what is there and he fantasizes about what is not. I mean, that sound familiar about your own work and your own studies? Have you ever abhorred what is there and fantasized about what is not when it comes to your work? That's sloth. In sloth, we abhor what is. And I want to suggest that what we particularly abhor are limits, place, order, and responsibility. Rather than lazing about, in fact, the slothful are often a frenzy of activity. Now this, now that, in their disgust. For the work that they've been given, they're supposed to attend to. But you know how easy it is to become active as you do anything else other than the work at hand? Evagrius describes the slothful monk as consuming himself doing good works for other monks. Isn't that interesting? He's not just wasting time. He's not doing something indulgent. He's busily scanning how he can help other people. But that's not his work just now. His work just now is to be in his cell at prayer. Your work just now is to be working on that problem set. It's not to be helping your neighbor just now. Now maybe it is if your neighbor's in great need, or your neighbor is your neighbor right there. But if you're distracting yourself from your work, there's an abhorrence of this life. So, like the judge, the slothful find reality to be boring, to be bereft of meaning, to fail to captivate. They view reality as bleached out, as having very little color, very little taste, very little effervescence to it. Where, of course, as you know, the Holy Spirit resides deep down things. Everything is an occasion where God is communicating. The sower is spreading his grace at every moment. The Jesuit practice of examen is a good one at this, if you've ever done this. For the Jesuits, when you do the examen, you're paying particular attention to the emotional states that you've had throughout the day, and the times which seemed most boring, most onerous, most difficult, were the times where God was especially trying to communicate to you and you weren't paying any attention. So at the moment where the problem set is the most taxing and you busy yourself with your phone, or you busy yourself with a call, or you suddenly decide to call your aunt, you say, I should call mom. You haven't called mom in weeks, but right now it's time to call mom. That is your resistance to order, resistance to the being, the resistance to where God is attempting to communicate to you just now. Lars Svensson puts it this way: the pell-mell rush for diversions precisely indicates the emptiness that surrounds us. This rush, the demand for satisfaction and the lack of satisfaction that comes with that, are inextricably intertwined. The more strongly individual life becomes the center of focus, the stronger the insistence on meaning among the trivialities of everyday life will make everyday life appear as a prison. But everyday life is not a prison, because everyday life is the gift that God has offered us to live, including the particularities and details If we think of everyday life as a prison, it sounds a whole lot like the slothful monk who now has hatred at his work and hatred of his place, and where time crawls so slowly. That's a hatred of place. That's sloth in the first sense from Evagrius, a hatred of responsibility. Second, sloth in its second form, sadness. While Evagrius articulates sloth as a hatred against place, limits, and life, Thomas Aquinas explains acedia as a sadness at the divine good and as an aversion to acting. As he explains, the divine good at which sloth feels sorrow is communion with God. That's what God offers us, is communion with God's own self. So sadness at the divine good is sadness at the offer of friendship with God. Now, this is a very strange phenomenon. If the theistic and Christian story is at all true, then the claim is that communion with God is our happiness. Everyone desires to be happy, but the slothful are sad at the offer of happiness made to them. Now that's a strange contradiction or a strange tension, yes? I would like to offer you sadness, and you feel an aversion to happiness, or even a sadness at the offer of happiness. Why would one ever feel sadness at the offer of happiness? It seems to be just the opposite. How would we explain this? It's like loathing your own good. Well, it's odd, but it's not unusual. Sloth resists friendship with God, which is our happiness, sadness of the divine good, because of the burdens of commitment. The burdens of commitment that such a friendship and its concomitant transformation of self requires. Here we seem to love our own freedom and our lack of attachments rather more than we love friendship with God. And so if friendship with God requires our attention, our duty, our obligation, our change of life, we would rather be free than happy. We would rather be autonomous than delighted. So think about how friendship works. I can't remember what movie this is from, but I tell a joke that my wife always frowns and scolds me for. She'll say, you should get together with so-and-so, and I'll say, I don't have time in my life for new friends right now. Have you ever had that experience? Someone has offered you friendship and you kind of recoil from it, not because there's anything so undesirable about this person, but because you realize that if you were friends with them, you would have to invest time and effort and affection and care. You would have to attend, if it was real friendship, to their needs rather than your own. Now, I suspect, if you're like me, when you sit or kneel or wait to do your prayer, that is your recoil from prayer, right? Here, friendship with the divine is being offered to you. And what could be worse than to receive friendship with the divine if it means you have to attend and listen and be cautious and attentive and maybe change your life and your desires? I'd rather be free and I'd rather not act, right? Sadness and an aversion to acting, than I would rather be happy. But why would we reject happiness in order to be free? Now, it seems to me that Thomas is onto something here when he says that sloth immobilizes the person. It leads to an aversion to acting. This is not just laziness. This is a hatred of the idea of acting. It's a love of stasis or paralysis. Well, why? Well, let's think about how this works. Well, what it means to be a person. I'd suggest that we are, first and foremost, not thinking things. Descartes is wrong here yet again, but we are rather and primarily desiring and loving things. Augustine is correct. We desire. And all of our desires indicate our soul's deep thirst. Hearts are restless until they rest in thee. In a way that we do not explicitly understand, or at least I don't explicitly understand, whenever we're reaching out for any good thing in action, no matter how mundane that good thing is, we are reaching for God and the reflection of God's goodness in that mundane good thing. But if we now have a sadness at our ultimate good, it calls into question the meaning and purpose of all of the secondary goods, does it not? I suspect you've had this experience at some point in your studies if you're a student. I think it often happens second semester sophomore year or first semester junior year. Right? The excitement and despair of the freshman year is past. You have a friend group. You don't have to have a map anymore. Right? You kind of know what you're doing. But you also realize that graduation is 2 years away, 1.5 years away, and there's a lot yet to do. And you begin to think something like the following: what is the point? Anyone had this experience? What is the point? Right? When you lose sight of the end of your actions, it's not just that the end of the actions appear meaningless, the particular steps that one has to take to get to that end also become meaningless. So if we begin to feel a sense that the change that we would need in our life to become friends with God is a source of sadness, and we have an aversion to being friends with God, what meaning is left for the particular goods for us to take actions towards, because they have meaning only against the ultimate horizon? We're all aware that I know, I'm certainly aware, that I can distract myself long enough until I recognize that the distraction that I'm engaging in is really mine just ignoring my experience of the nihil or the nothingness of life, yes? And at that point, I have a choice to make. I can either convince myself that this particular finite good is of almost infinite worth, which I can never convince myself of, because it's not of infinite worth. Any academic will have this experience. If you remember when you got your first publication as a grad student, how exciting it was? And then the very next day you thought, well, it was a mid-tier journal. I better get a better one. And then you did another one and another one and another one. And you got to be a keynote somewhere. And you thought, well, that's very exciting. I'm a keynote, right? I've got a secret list, I shouldn't tell you this, of all the schools I want to speak at, right? I've got 2 more to go that I just need to knock off. So good job, UT. I'll leave it. Were we on the list or not? What will happen when that's done? Nothing. I will need something else. So either I can convince myself that this finite good is infinite, or I can have an eye towards the infinite good, and with an eye to the infinite good, recognize that the finite good is a foretaste, an icon, a participation in that infinite good. But if I'm sad about the infinite good, good luck trying to be happy about the particular goods. Good luck trying to convince yourself to act, to do, or to be. It's not going to work. As a result, acedia generally looks like this: a profound withdrawal into self. Just a profound withdrawal into self. Action is no longer perceived to be good. It's no longer perceived to be a response to a call of love, a response of love which enables our action and gives it meaning, which sanctifies our action, which allows us to see it as participating in our quest, our journey towards the divine, our return to God. That all goes away and for the slothful, and all we're left is this particular action in front of us that doesn't appear to have any meaning, and distraction is better than recognizing the meaninglessness of this action. And so we profoundly sink into self. We disappear. Now, I want to suggest for your reflection that sloth is not just a particular vice. Like, I'm not just giving you, I don't think, like R.J. Snell's psychology here. Like, when I was writing this book, Amy, my wife, would say, "Are you done that book on sloth yet?" And I would say no, and she would kind of joke, like, "Ha ha ha, yeah, I know, right?" It figures. When I was writing my dissertation, I had this awful year where she was getting up at like 4:30 in the morning to commute to this terrible job, right? She was paying the bills. I had some like small grad stipend, but I had won this big award, so I didn't have any teaching responsibilities at all, which meant I did precisely nothing most of the days. So she would show up, I would sort of look and think, oh, Amy's gonna be home at 5 o'clock, that's in 15 minutes. I better shower and make it look like I've been doing something today. And for like a month and straight, she would come and feel my hair, and I had hair then. She'd feel my hair and say, "It's wet, you just showered, didn't you?" And I was like, "Yes, I did. I just showered just now." I don't want to suggest this is just RJ sharing his like weird psychology with you about hatred of particular goods and hatred of life and hatred of work, or a sadness at the divine good and thus an aversion to acting. I want to suggest this is one of the besetting sins and vices of our age. That this describes not just RJ's bad life, this describes the bad life of most Americans or a whole lot of people in the developed West. I'm going to appeal to the late John Paul II for that. In Veritatis Splendor, John Paul II identifies 2 forms of contemporary disintegrations. First, the rupture between freedom and truth, and second, the rupture between faith and morality. The first is a philosophical rupturing. It abandons freedom to what he thinks of as subjectivistic choice, without guidance from the truth of being. The second is a theological rupture, which makes faith extrinsic and unrelated to action. It makes moral principle divorced from faith, and makes faith perhaps a matter of the inner heart, perhaps a matter of getting to heaven, but it doesn't bring about purpose in life where the particularities of our life are somehow ordered to the divine. We're sort of hanging out until we can get out of here, right? When the roll is called up yonder, we'll be there, and this isn't so meaningful. I like to call that pious nihilism, the kind of Christian who is so heavenly minded that this world is beyond their concern, which of course is not remotely the story, the Christian story, where God was so concerned for the finite and the particular and the temporal as to incarnate as one of us and to do human things and to do them very well. Now, on the one hand, the late Pope asks if we have sundered freedom from truth, choice from responsibility, which is to say, have we violated the work that God has given us to do? I think we are, because I think increasingly we don't view our work, where we're going to relate freedom to truth, in the way of the story of Genesis asks us to do it. If you recall the story of Genesis, we're put into the garden, and we're asked to tend, to keep, to fill, and to guard the garden, yes? Now, I think this is very important. There's a lot of people who sort of imagine that the task of the Christian or the task of salvation is to either like keep the world really pure or maybe to go back to the garden. As if what we are in the garden are sort of God's hired gardeners. So I don't have a hired gardener, but if I did, I would want him to do the garden exactly as I told him to do. If I came home and there was topiary, I would not be very pleased, right? I want an iris here and a rose bush there, and that's all I want. That's not the story that God has given to the human being. God tells us to fill the garden, to keep the garden, to guard the garden, but also to have dominion over the garden. That doesn't mean to destroy. It means to perfect in a way that's in keeping with the integrity of the garden, but which allows for development and advance and change. It's a pretty big deal that God gives us work, right? Work is one of the primary blessings that God gives us in the garden. But it's not there for us to destroy the garden, and it's not there for us to just keep the garden pristine. One of the things the Pope is claiming here is that because we in the West have become so dominated, these are his words, with having and doing rather than being, we look at the world as empty resource. Heidegger calls this standing reserve. I don't know if you know this section from Heidegger, I'm paraphrasing it. There's two men look at a mountain, yes? One of them sees an object of art and poetry, the other sees coal. If you look at the world as coal, you're in the world of standing reserve. But here's the thing. It seems to me that a whole lot of us in the West view everything as standing reserve. Our relations, our romance, our sexual relations, our children, our teachers, our friends, our religion, the world itself, as standing reserve. As something that is useful to us or threatening to us, but not as something with which we join together in the perfection of the world, which is the question or the work that God has given us to do. Perfect this world, develop the garden. If we view the world as standing reserve, we've sundered truth from freedom, and we love our freedom more than we love truth, and we will inevitably see the world as something to use and cast aside. In that case, we're not so different from Judge Halden, are we? We use our knowledge to capture the world, we sketch the birds, and then we scratch them out. The way that John Paul II puts it as follows: we no longer recognize and respect the world's essential link with truth. Out of a desire for emancipation, we wish to emancipate ourselves from all forms of authority and to be free. Michael Hanby puts it this way: we increasingly view the world as lacking beauty and depth and purpose. This is earlier what I called bleaching it out. Hanby calls this a double nihilism or a double knotting, N-O-U-G-H-T-I-N-G, a knotting, right? A making nothing of the world in two forms. Here's the first. This is Michael Hanby. Our culture assumes that our lives are innately and intrinsically meaningless unless there is a constant stream of stimulation and distraction. Sound like Evagrius's monk? Constant stream of distraction, looking out the window, looking to see if the sun has moved, right? If the new season of White Lotus if we have to wait just one more week, I don't know what that is, but I've seen a lot of ads for it today. I was on a bus at the airport. It must be great. If we don't have constant stream of stimulation and distraction, a stream which, like all distractions, is subject to the laws of diminishing returns. We all know this, yes, it becomes less and less interesting as we do it. This creates a sense of nullity on the side of the subject, and a similar nullity or noting on the side of the world. For latent in this assumption is the denial of form, the denial of objective beauty, and the denial of an objective or true order of goods that would naturally compel our interest. Side note, years ago when my wife and I had a little child, she was just little at the time, we had said that the main goal we had in our parenting and the education of our children is that they lived in a large room with many interests, meaning a large world with many interests. And the paraphrase we gave to that is we wanted them to have bright eyes. Yeah? You know the people who feel compelled to be interested in things? You know that person? Right? That's a person who does not have sloth, because what they see is something worth noting because there is something good to note. Right? Our interests are compelled when we see something which is beautiful or true or noble or honorable. We're bored when we don't see anything to be compelled by. Now, Hanby continues, it's not just that we view the world as nihilistic and nothing, we view ourselves as the sort of people who cannot be interested. Not only is the world not compelling, we view ourselves as people who can't be compelled, who can't be interested. I know you've had this experience. You've been to an art museum. Is it Blanton in town? Is it the art museum? And you know you've had this experience. You've been to an art museum. There's a wonderful piece, and you're sort of observing the piece, but then because you're a human being, you start to observe the people observing the piece. And what do you tend to notice about the people observing the piece? Not you, of course, other people. They're not observing the piece. They're reading about the piece, or they're taking a picture of themselves with the piece. Yes? You've seen these pictures, haven't you? You've seen the pictures of the Louvre. There's the Mona Lisa, right? There's like 1,000 people jammed around the Mona Lisa. But what is everyone doing when they're around the Mona Lisa? Not looking at the Mona Lisa, right? If you've ever read the novel from the 90s, White Noise, there's a famous episode of the most photographed barn in America. It's a sort of joke about postmodern culture. So have you ever went to one of these tourist traps in like nowhere America, where it's like the world's largest Easter egg, or the world's largest fork, or the world's most photographed barn? Yeah? Why do you go to see the world's most photographed barn? To take a picture. When you take the picture of the world's most photographed barn, what do you do to the status of the world's most photographed barn? You cement its status. Are you interested in the barn? You're not interested in the barn. You're interested in the photography of the barn. Hanby's point is, and I think it's worth considering this about yourself and about our culture, is it the case that we increasingly view the world as uninteresting, but as owing us something, but disappointing us because not meeting its obligation to interest us? See what I'm trying to suggest there? We think the world is duty-bound to interest us, and then we're not interested because it's uninteresting, one. And two, do you see in yourself and do you see in our culture, I'm suggesting the answer to these two questions is yes, a failure to be interested. Almost an inability to be interested. The world is boring and you are bored. Hanby says that's the double nihilism of the contemporary state of affairs. I want to suggest that that's slothful. That's what sloth is. So my question, are we the judge? Do we live in a time of sloth? Rather than causing delight and comfort, is the truth of reality, which has the deepest freshness, the dearest freshness deep down in things, is the truth of being the promise of communion with God, thought repugnant to our sovereignty and our autonomy and our freedom? Do we view it as too much responsibility and it makes us sad? Do we view it as not worth seeking in its particularities? So we have a hatred of the particularity of the offer of how God reaches to us. Are we all become the judge? Have we thought of ourselves as suzerains, where we get to countermand all other laws? Do we increasingly think that the limits, think the monk's cell where there's a hatred of this place, meaning a hatred of these limits? Do we increasingly in our society think of the limits of the body, or the limits of sexuality, or the limits of death? Blessings are merely obstacles to overcome to serve our purposes and our whims. Do we view the limits of our life as the very graciousness of being, the very graciousness of God making being in this way, so that we can be in this particular fashion? Think about what it would mean to have no nature. It would not be to be ultimately free, it would be to be nothing. If you're going to be a this sort of thing as opposed to a that sort of thing, you have to be a this, not a that, yes? How many of us wish that there were no particularities to our life, to our bodies, to our form, to our choices? Do we wish to scratch out creation, especially the things we find annoying about creation, fearing that anything outside of our control destroys our freedom? That's what John Paul II called the culture of death. Can we avoid the culture of death? Or does it, like the judge, hunt us, asserting its control, trying to embrace us, claiming a terrible covenant over us? In the novel, some resisted Judge Halden, but just a few, it seems. They attempted a kind of fidelity to the good, to the true, to the beautiful. They guarded some clemency in their soul, and they were stalked and hunted by the judge. What I'm asking is, are you being stalked and hunted by Sloth? Thank you very much.